Over 2 decades, the Kaiser had slowly built a navy to challenge British supremacy of the seas. By 1914, aided by the wealth of its industry and the expertise of its engineers, Germany had become the most powerful military state in Europe. The Great War had finally come. She was called Big Bertha after the boss's wife, a monster cannon 24 feet long and weighing almost 100 tons. A single gun required a crew of 200 attendants for setup and firing. The Krupps were the most important industrial family in early Germany, and especially in that part of it called Prussia. The products of Krupp factories were the fruits of German ingenuity and craftsmanship. Bold ideas superbly executed and engineered. The kinds of projects that have characterized Germany's industrial prowess and have made its military industry the basis of much of its political power for over a century. Of Germany's states, the largest and strongest was Prussia. It had great natural resources, mineral wealth, and huge industrial potential. It was the disciplined army of Prussia which had turned the tide of battle at Waterloo in 1815, defeating Napoleon and redrawing the map of Europe. Up until then, Germany was a collection of princely states, what one historian called, not a nation, but a name. But it was another 50 years before the skill of a Prussian diplomat and the brute force of the Prussian army were to actually create a unified German empire. Otto von Bismarck was born in 1815. He was a man of enormous power, not simply in Prussia, but across all Europe. Bismarck was foreign minister of Prussia, the strongest personality on the continent, and the most awesome political force which Europe had seen since Napoleon. His speeches left no doubt that Prussia was destined to be the center of a new German state.
Place in the hands of the King of Prussia the strongest possible military power. Then he will be able to carry out the policy you wish. This policy cannot succeed through speeches and shooting matches and songs. It can only be carried out through blood and iron.
In fact, it was blood and iron rather than diplomacy which carried the day. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 through 71 was the last of a series of wars spearheaded by Prussia and underpinned by its industrial and economic might. It succeeded in forging 300 separate kingdoms into a single nation, a new empire, or Reich, which would replace the old order. On January 18, 1871, William I was proclaimed Emperor of Germany in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Germany had at last become a nation. Situated in the heart of Europe, the Kaiser's new realm stretched from Königsberg and Danzig in the east to Strasbourg in the west. To the south, German-speaking Switzerland was a boundary. To the southeast was Austria-Hungary, a fierce rival. Poland and Tsarist Russia were to the east, and an old foe, France, to the west. Germany was the biggest country in Europe. Aided by war reparations paid by the French, new projects were built on a tremendous scale. Industry was helped along by German banks, which had a free hand to invest their own and their depositors' money where they saw fit. There was an industrial boom. In the 3 years following the end of the war in 1871, more companies were formed in Prussia than in all previous years combined. German industry was quick to adopt foreign industrial and manufacturing processes and to make improvements and changes as necessary. Coal production, vital for the development of heavy industry, also increased after unification. In 1871, German coal production was less than a third of Great Britain's, the world's leading producer. Much of it was centered in the Ruhr area around Düsseldorf, Essen, and along the Rhine Valley. But German production grew tremendously. By 1913, Germany was producing as much coal as Great Britain. The German rail system grew explosively, uniting the country and allowing for the easy, cheap movement of goods and people. The muddy, rutted roads of earlier times were now replaced by steel rails, as useful in mobilizing and transporting men as in transporting raw material. On the back of industrialization, companies like Siemens and AEG, the former German Edison Society, led the electrification of German cities. Cheap and reliable power was brought into cities and towns across the country. Industrial activity was vigorous. Germany became the industrial superpower of Europe. And unlike England and America, where monopoly agreements were either illegal or simply void, in Germany, monopolies and cartels were a fact of life. Companies grew, merged, took each other over, and formed huge cartels, monopolizing markets and dictating prices. An ever-increasing number of workers were needed to feed this economic colossus, and foreigners began streaming into the Reich. From Poland, Russia, Austria, Italy, they came to Germany in search of work and wages. Most of these workers were engaged in manual labor, stone quarries, brickworks, mining, and iron and steel manufacturing. Wherever danger, dirt, and muscle were needed, foreign labor was usually there in abundance. Despite their increasing numbers and pivotal role in the economy, these foreign laborers were far outside the mainstream of German society. A prominent Leipzig professor sounded the alarm in 1910.
It may sound chauvinistic Germany for the Germans, but it is not meant to be. These words harbor a basic truth. If we grant permits to foreign workers to the extent desired by the employers, we are heading for serious trouble. Inbreeding with all those alien elements can only spell disaster for the purity of the Germanic tribes. May Providence protect Germany from witnessing the spectacle of our own native sons wasting away in favor of foreign nationals.
An editorial in a nationalist German newspaper left no doubt as to the nature of the problem. It is high time we started to search seriously for some remedy. We must endeavor to keep such persons at a far remove from the body of our nation and to eradicate them on the spot. Much of Germany's ambition was a result of its rivalry with its European neighbors, especially Great Britain. For centuries, the Royal Navy had projected England's power abroad. It was admiration for Britain and jealousy of British naval power more than anything else which led to the creation of the German fleet. I had a peculiar passion for the Navy, Kaiser Wilhelm wrote in his memoirs. It sprang, to no small extent, from my English blood. In fact, the royal families of the two nations were very much intertwined. England's imperious monarch, Queen Victoria, was mostly of German blood. She married a German, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, a first cousin. The couple's first child was named Victoria Louise. The Princess Royal was called Vicky by her family. Vicky was close in age to the young Prince Friedrich of Prussia, and the two royal families decided to further cement close relations by marrying the young people. In 1858, their Royal Highnesses, Victoria Louise, the Princess Royal, and Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia were thus married. The couple soon had a son named Wilhelm. This child was the grandson of Queen Victoria. English and German blood mixed equally in his veins. It was perhaps only natural that the young Wilhelm regarded his English cousins with a mixture of jealousy and envy. Little had changed when he took the throne 30 years later in 1888. Berlin, at the end of the last century, the capital of Prussia and the cultural center of Germany. But it was a new capital, florid and pretentious, possessing little of the charm of older cities in Europe. Many of Berlin's great buildings, including the Reichstag, were built at the time. This was a society with a lively intellectual and artistic life, one which had produced both the classical idealism of Goethe and of Beethoven and the turbulent romanticism of Schumann, Brahms, and Wagner. But despite these achievements, German insecurities persisted. How could the new Kaiser achieve parity with his English cousins on the world scene? A navy was the key. Yet sea power had never been an important element in earlier German military campaigns. The man responsible for Germany's eventual mastery of the sea was Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. With his long, forked beard, he became a recognizable figure to a generation of Germans. He personally lobbied both the public and the politicians for Germany's successful naval buildup. Slowly, he convinced both Kaiser and Parliament to set aside growing sums of money for the establishment of a German navy. Tirpitz believed that it was Germany's destiny as a great power to have a great navy, not simply to protect the Reich, but also to ensure Germany's commercial position. German overseas expansion, he proclaimed, was as irresistible as a law of nature. The German Parliament summed up German feelings on the matter. To protect Germany's sea trade and colonies in the existing circumstances, there is only one means. Germany must have a battle fleet so strong that even for the adversary with the greatest sea power, a war against it would involve such dangers as to imperil their own position in the world. Tirpitz had help from powerful quarters. The expertise of the Krupp family extended beyond the giant guns and into steel ship hulls as well. The company had already taken over the ailing Germania shipyards in Kiel on Germany's north coast. Investing millions of marks, the Krupps proceeded to modernize their acquisition. The family became a major builder of both ships and submarines. Krupp expertise ran the gamut. Guns, armored steel plates for hulls, boilers, machines, the firm could build an entire fleet with virtually no recourse to outside help. Although the Kaiser was the Queen of England's grandson as well as German emperor, he seemed not to understand the implications of the German buildup. This new navy was a direct challenge to the foundations of British independence and prosperity. Slowly, the reality of Tirpitz's fleet, his navy against England, began to sink into British consciousness. Friendship and relative indifference to Germany were gradually replaced by apprehension and distrust. Rather than as allies, the British began to see the Germans as upstarts and potential rivals threatening the bases of British power. In order to assure their unquestioned supremacy of the oceans, England responded to the German challenge. The construction of the HMS Dreadnought revolutionized naval warfare. She was twice as powerful as anything which had come before. She was a 17,000-ton armored battleship, which Britain completed in 1906. The ship was a behemoth, equipped with 10 12-inch guns and 24 12-pound quick-fire guns. The public's fancy was captured, and soon the complex issues of strategy and the makeup of the fleet was swept away. Dreadnoughts were the only things that mattered in measuring who was ahead. Soon the race to build the most dreadnoughts was on, with both sides striving to complete an ever greater number of the huge ships. In Britain, the dreadnought was followed by Colossus, Hercules, Orion, Thunderer, Monarch, and Conqueror. In Berlin, Tirpitz and the Kaiser were building their own fleet. The Deutschland, both smaller and slower than the dreadnought, was launched in 1904. The Nassau, the Kaiser's first dreadnought-class battleship, was begun in 1906, followed by the Westfalen, the Posen, and the Rhineland. These ships and the fast armored cruisers which accompanied them were the centerpiece of the Tirpitz plan to challenge Britain and to project German power on the world stage. Realizing how costly it would be to retain the supremacy of the seas, Britain approached Germany to find out whether some mutual cutback would be possible. But it was too late. Neither the Reichstag nor the German public would have accepted this break on German ambitions. The Kaiser wrote to his ambassador in London,
"I do not wish a good understanding with England at the expense of the extension of the German fleet. The German fleet is not built against anybody, and not against England either, but according to our needs. This has been said quite clearly in the Navy law and has remained unchanged for 11 years. This law is being carried out to the very last tittle. Whether the British like it or not does not worry us. If they want a war, they must start it. We are not afraid of it."
Although the Kaiser's navy was firmly rooted in tradition, German inventors were already exploring an entirely new naval technology. Wilhelm Bauer was an early pioneer in the field of submarine development. Although most of Bauer's projects were within the realm of 19th century technology, he was considered a visionary and had difficulty getting support for the construction of his submersible ships. But Bauer's early drawings and designs led the way for subsequent designers and engineers in Germany as they developed the world's first underwater ships, called U-boats in German, for undersea boats. In 1906, Krupp's Germania shipyards completed the first modern submarine, the U-1. It was a revolutionary weapon, and one against which Germany's potential enemies and rivals had no protection. But Tirpitz, never a technical visionary, thought little of the new invention. His devotion to a battleship strategy both played into the strength of his major adversary, Great Britain, and restricted his appreciation of new weapons systems. In fact, as weapons, the early U-boats weren't much. Their average cruising speed was 5 knots, and each had only 4 torpedo tubes and several mines. But if the military was puzzled by Bauer's invention, they were even more perplexed by the work of another German inventor. By the turn of the century, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin had spent decades thinking about motor-driven airships. With his white walrus mustache, the retired cavalry officer was nearly 62 years old when he made the first 18-minute flight on July 2nd, 1900. His first rigid airship, the LZ-1, was kept aloft by 16 bags full of hydrogen enclosed in a fabric-covered, cigar-shaped aluminum framework. The giant ship was powered by 2 14-horsepower engines manufactured by Gottlieb Daimler, which ran 2 metal propellers. Although the German military was never enthusiastic about the airship, it was too unreliable, too slow, and too dependent on the weather, the press was in awe. No other country had anything that could match the Zeppelin in size or load. To support the Count was almost a patriotic duty. What other people, wrote a German military newspaper, can produce an airship anywhere comparable to our Zeppelin cruisers? Another early visionary was Otto Lilienthal, who helped pave the way for manned flight long before the Wright brothers. He was the first person to have designed and systematically tested aircraft that were heavier than air. Beginning in 1891, he constructed and tested at least 18 types of aircraft and conducted more than 200 gliding tests. He died in a glider crash only 5 years after he began, in 1896. But the dream of flight and the flexibility and mobility it could bring in waging war enticed the imaginations of German military leaders. The German Imperial Air Force was organized in 1912. The earliest of the military planes were clumsy and ineffective. Rapid changes in altitude could burst eardrums. The roar and vibrations of the engines battered the pilot and crew continually. Goggles restricted vision, and the extreme cold of the winter months made higher altitudes almost deadly. Another new weapon resulted from the pioneering work of German chemists. Fritz Haber was one of Germany's leading industrial scientists. He was of Jewish origin, but had converted to Christianity as a young man. Just before the outbreak of World War I, Haber was at work at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. There, he revived an old idea, using noxious poison on the enemy instead of guns. A colleague described the feverish activity surrounding Haber's attempt to create a chlorine gas weapon.
We could hear the tests that Professor Haber was carrying out at the back of the Institute with the military authorities, who in their steel gray car came to Haber's Institute every morning. The work was pushed day and night, and many times I saw activity in the building at 11 o'clock in the evening. It was common knowledge that Haber was pushing these men as hard as he could.
By 1913, Haber was well on his way to developing a chlorine gas weapon. It would be manufactured with industrial methods and would constitute an additional arm for the German military. New technologies began to entice the military mind. 20th century militarism required technology and industrial excellence in order to achieve results, and Germany had the requisite elements. As the conflicting ambitions and aspirations of Europe's great powers broke out into the open, the German arsenal was full. Conflict started far to the south, with a pistol shot in the Balkans. It spread with dizzying effect. In Central Europe, Serbs, Croatians, and others staked conflicting territorial claims and entered into shaky alliances. In August 1914, Germany declared war on Russia and France. German troops swept through neutral Belgium on their way into France, outraging the rest of Europe, which had maintained Belgian neutrality since the kingdom was established 75 years before. The option of diplomacy was thus forfeited from the start. German leaders promised a quick victory, and for the young men so enthusiastic to go to war, the mud of the trenches, the explosions of the grenades, and the whiz of the bullets were still to come. F.L. Cassel, a 25-year-old reservist in 1914, remembered the mobilization of troops as the country went to war.
A medical examination at the Alexanderstrasse barracks. Are you healthy? Yes. Able-bodied, infantry. That was the medical examination. After 4 weeks, we had to make room in the barracks for the next levy. At the beginning of September, we left Darmstadt for further training as the 1st Reserve Battalion Infantry Regiment 116 in Rheinhessen. Bouquet on top of the rifle. We left the barracks with the band playing. We came into a small village, Sprendlingen, and were quartered with farmers who looked very well after us with food and drink. Our new training consisted mainly in marching and rifle service. We were not really soldiers enough to be more than cannon fodder.
In the air, another new technology was finding a military application. By early 1915, Zeppelins were being used to drop bombs on England. The giant flying machines either skirted English artillery fire or flew at an altitude beyond its reach. The British were terrified, and Zeppelin sightings were reported across the country. So worried was England that the job of deterring Zeppelin attacks was given to an up-and-coming naval star, a young and aggressive officer named Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. It was easy to see why England was so terrified. In the summer of 1915, the German Zeppelin L-13 struck London. An assistant engineman on duty that night had vivid memories of the event.
We were at about 8,500 feet when we released our 660-pounder. You could see a whole mass of structures and street paving swallowed up in a tremendous crater, even at our height. We were awestruck and frozen, caught in the glare of what seemed like a dozen searchlights. "Let's get the hell out of here," someone shouted from the other engine gondola. I agreed. but the commander continued circling. We still had a few more bombs on board, and he was going to use them. Damn, but he was a great airship officer. What a huge target we were, and all that we needed was one direct hit to go up in flames. That would have been death for all 16 on board. We never carried parachutes. The policy of the High Command was to use every ounce of each Zeppelin's carrying capacity for bombs, not for parachutes.
The demise of the Zeppelin came only after the Allies were finally able to design a plane which could fly high enough to attack them. After terrorizing London for many months, the Allied pilots were at last able to bring the highly flammable airships within range. The giants began their slow death, but the race for air supremacy had only just begun. The fields of Ypres had already seen the blood of thousands of young men when Fritz Haber's invention made its debut. The Second Battle of Ypres began April 22nd of the next year. It was 6 in the afternoon, and the wind was blowing from the west-northwest. Over 6,000 canisters of chlorine gas were hurled by mortars into Allied territory. The gas turned out to be devastatingly effective, far beyond the most wild imaginings of German army strategists. The soldiers on the other side would never forget the agony.
Gassed cases kept coming in, led along in parties of about 6 by an orderly. They sat or lay down in the grass, evidently suffering a great deal, chiefly from their eyes, which were covered up by pieces of lint. The gas was mustard gas, which causes temporary blindness from swelling of conjunctiva and lids.
The stream of men increased. Those who could see led the way, while the others formed a queue behind, each one placing his hands on the shoulders of his predecessor for guidance. After vomiting, I had not felt any ill effects, but after a short while my eyes became very painful, so I joined hands with my friend, Lyon, and together we went to the aid station. The hard-worked doctors and several orderlies did what they could. Drops were injected into the eyes of everyone in turn. The drops completely dimmed the eyesight, and by 11 a.m., I was totally blind. Extreme fatigue, fever, and pain overcame me. On regaining consciousness, I was in the 47th General Hospital at Le Tréport. The date was August 2nd. I had not had a bath since the previous May. I was loaded with vermin and had not had my boots off for 15 or 16 days. My sympathies were with the nurses. For the first few days, I spent my time sleeping and coughing. The marquee was full of gas cases, and there was a steady stream of shuffling feet, which denoted stretchers being brought in and carried out, some of the latter to the mortuary.
It is no wonder that the troops at Ypres panicked and scattered, leaving a hole 4 miles wide in their defensive line. But the Germans, never totally convinced by Haber's invention, were taken by surprise. They had not anticipated the effectiveness of the gas. German troops passed through the breach, but were unprepared to mount a large-scale attack. Canadian troops, despite being caught in the gas attack, fought and died, preventing Germany from overrunning Allied positions. During April and May, the Germans used 500 tons of chlorine gas discharged from over 20,000 cylinders. Fritz Haber himself did not escape unscathed. Haber was bitterly disappointed in the military results at Ypres, complaining that the army did not take the new weapon seriously. His wife Clara pleaded with him to give up his work and to stay home. Unceasing in his devotion to furthering the cause of poison gas, Haber refused his wife's pleas and headed for the Eastern Front, where in 3 devastating attacks west of Warsaw, the Russians suffered their first casualties from poison gas. 25,000 men killed or wounded. By the end of the war, the poorly protected Russians will suffer 500,000 casualties. A stunning testament to the effectiveness of Haber's invention. But Haber's obsession with his work also had a personal cost. On the night he left home for the Eastern Front, his wife Clara committed suicide. The reason has never been determined. As the war turned against Germany, Admiral Tirpitz finally realized that he had made a critical mistake by ignoring submarine technology. Tirpitz decided to gamble the ability of his U-boat fleet to blockade Britain and force her into submission. The area around the United Kingdom was declared a war zone by the Germans. Ships were subject to attack without warning. For the first year, the campaign was a spectacular success. Almost 1 million tons of shipping was sent to the bottom of the sea. Submarine panic swept the British fleet, with lookouts constantly claiming sightings of German U-boats. Pilots of the 250 airplanes which were fit for active service in the early years of the war often brought along rifles and pistols. Bombing was equally crude, usually consisting of pilots dropping hand grenades and small explosives, even bricks, over the side of their small planes. At first, the pilots themselves were considered little better than chauffeurs, with only the gunners given officer status. Many of them had been riding horses in the German cavalry when the war began. But now, this young, intrepid group of flyers quickly seized the public imagination. The celebrated flying aces were a new kind of soldier. With their easy self-confidence and daring, they epitomized the glamour which was part of early aviation. The most celebrated German flyer was Manfred von Richthofen, better known by his nickname, the Red Baron. He was as feared and respected by the Allies as he was idolized by the Germans. The Red Baron remembers his encounter with one British ace, Lenox Hawker.
It did not take long before one dove for me, trying to catch me from behind. After a burst of 5 shots, the Sky Fellow had to stop, for I was already in a sharp left curve. The Englishman attempted to get behind me while I attempted to get behind him. So it went, both of us flying like madmen in a circle, with engines running full out at 3,000-meter altitude. First left, then right, each intent on getting above and behind the other. He had a very maneuverable crate, but mine climbed better, and I finally succeeded in coming in above and behind him.
In the end, Richthofen forced Hawker down to his death, only about 50 meters behind German lines. Although these dogfights had only a minor impact on the course of the war, they did excite the public imagination. The German, French, and British public thrilled to the inherent drama of men and their flying machines fighting to the death in the night sky. Aerial combat became half duel, half minuet between pilots who circled, looped, and climbed around each other. But in the skies over France in April of 1918, the hunters were also the hunted. Trying for his 81st kill, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, was struck in the right front chest by a bullet, and he died in the crash. But even as guns and bayonets were being replaced by these more modern weapons of the 20th century, endless streams of young men still fought and died in the killing fields. In his novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, Eric Marie Remarque recalled his own experiences of trench warfare.
Attack, counterattack, charge, repulse. These are words, but what things they signify. Modern trench warfare demands knowledge and experience. A man must have a feeling for the contours of the ground, an ear for the sound and character of the shells, must be able to decide beforehand where they will drop, how they will burst, and how to shelter from them. The young recruits, of course, know none of these things. A man would like to spank them, they are so stupid, and to take them by the arm and lead them away from here, where they have no business to be.
At the Battle of the Marne, at Verdun, at the Somme, wave after wave of German, French, and British soldiers went over the tops of their trenches, packs of ammunition and supplies strapped to their backs, and bayonets fixed to their rifles. For 3 years, the great armies fought in these trenches at a virtual standstill. Despite more than 1 million casualties on each side, the trenches of the Western Front moved less than 10 miles in either direction. Of the 65 million men put into uniform by both sides, 37 million, more than half, became casualties. Virtually an entire generation had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in the Great War. Millions more, including the women and children who had stayed behind, were homeless. It was a thoroughly modern war, with a thoroughly modern form of killing. The first in which soldiers were strafed by automatic machine gun fire, blistered and choked by poison gas, torn apart by bombs and shells and mines. In the years to come, the crippled, the maimed, and the disfigured would be human reminders of the technology of war. Many were simply reported missing, buried anonymously in the bloody trenches where they served. The war ended, but the experience of warfare would never be the same.